It's an absolute honour and a privilege to give this talk today. I'm absolutely delighted with this promotion, and to be able to celebrate it on an occasion like this is amazing in front of my family. Look, watch out for this lot down the front, and my colleagues. It's an absolute privilege, and so thank you for coming. And I hope you can stay afterwards for a drink or two and some nibbles, and celebrate with us, even if you just want to celebrate the fact it's the weekend and the sun is shining. So I'm just going to start with a brief overview, a loose structure of this talk. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of background about myself, how I got here, my career to date, before moving on to talking about my first job. My first job, I think, was integral, actually, to why I'm standing here today. So I want to outline a bit about that. I will then go through some career highlights, and as I see it, and then outline some future plans, both in terms of future plans of where I see my research going, but also future in terms of using routine data to complement and enhance randomized controlled trials. So firstly then, why did I become a statistician? It's not very sexy. It certainly wasn't 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. And I've had all the usual statistician jibes over the years. The best one or the worst one, depending on your point of view, I was at a wedding in Cork of a school friend, and the Murphys was flowing as it does in Cork, and my friend introduced me to his friend, started chatting. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a statistician. Oh, did you not have enough charm to become an accountant? And I thought, ouch, that's pretty cutting. And of course, years later, when you're thinking, I'm preparing my inaugural lecture, of course, you can find that quote on the internet quite easily if you care to look. But now, of course, data, big data, making predictions, information, it's become quite the in thing, and we've got a new terminology for it, data science. And this is great because now it allows statisticians to be rude about someone else. Now I realise this cartoon may not tickle everyone's funny bones, but I thought it was quite good. This is illustrating perhaps some of the dangers that we face with this Johnny-come-lately data science and machine learning and the like. So I think what's behind this cartoon is clearly, look, we have to have strong methods underpinning what we're doing. Just mountains and mountains of data and digging around is not enough. But as Jill said, data science is one of our research themes at the Institute of Health and Wellbeing, and I hope I can illustrate in this lecture the opportunities that we can take things forward. Okay, so I hope these next couple of slides might explain a bit more of why I became a statistician. I sort of fell into it, I think, really. Now, does anyone know where this is? If you can read small writing, you might be able to tell. Anyone? Not the front row, obviously, but where's this? Milton Keynes, it is. It's Milton Keynes. So I grew up in Milton Keynes. My dad was a lecturer in economics at the Open University. See that Open University symbol over to the left? So maybe this online distance learning was in the genes all along. And I didn't do particularly great at school, but I did very, very good at a particular research project. And this, I think, is where my interest in research came. And it was comparative, and a lot of my work is comparative. And what I did is I compared the traffic flow in Milton Keynes to that in Bletchley. So Bletchley is an old market town, and breaking Enigma code, Alan Turing, etc. And Bletchley is to the south of Milton Keynes, and Milton Keynes kind of went on top of it. And so I stood at roundabouts and various intersections, counting, tallying, and yeah, it was an early foray into statistics and comparing the effectiveness of roundabouts versus traffic lights for traffic. And what was really interesting, as all the statistics projects I've been involved in, is you could learn about so many different areas. So I went to speak with the town planners of Milton Keynes, and you can see all these roundabouts here and all the intersecting roads. They explained that they could have made these roads absolutely dead straight, but they didn't for the fear of drivers getting bored. But clearly they weren't forward thinking enough, because driverless cars now, I guess straight roads would be the ideal. So after school, I went and did a degree in statistics and operational research at Coventry University, and then a PhD up here in Glasgow at Caledonian University, a PhD in experimental designs in statistics. So where did the subheading of my talk come from, to Lilybank and back again? So I started work as a research assistant here at the University of Glasgow in a unit called Public Health Research. And it was at 1 Lilybank Gardens, and I was a research assistant there for 2 years. I'm going to explain some more about that in a little bit. From there, I'd met Lorna at this stage, and I followed her, not in a stalky kind of way, to London, and I worked at the Eastman Dental Institute at UCL for 3 years. And I learned a lot there, because learning statistics in dental applications, dentistry has a lot of situations where the statistical independence assumption falls down, and you need to deal with clustered standard errors and multi-level modelling and the like. So I learned a great deal, and I was introduced to teaching postgraduate students. At this stage, I'd completed my PhD, and Lorna and I decided we fancied a bit of an adventure, so we kind of cast a wide net, and I went to New Zealand for an interview, which was good, and I got the job, and this was the picture of the main university building at the University of Otago. It looks a bit familiar, doesn't it? And I spent 2 really good years there as a lecturer. It was then back to London. Got a job at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I spent there 5 years almost, before completing the circle, coming back to 1 Lilybank Gardens, but the builders had been in and they'd knocked through, so it wasn't just one, it was 1, 2, 3 with interconnecting corridors. And I started off in a public health research group, and Pardeep there at the back, Pardeep Jund, want to thank him. I was his room buddy for the first couple of years, made me feel very welcome, and we did some really nice work using the routine data in Scotland on chronic disease, epidemiology and heart failure. And then where I am still, and a little bit later I'll give a bit more detail, I moved into the Health Economics and Health Technology Assessment Unit. But I want to spend a little time on my first job, because as I said earlier, it was very important to me. I learned so much in this 2 years. It was amazing. And it was a real lucky break, because after my funding for the PhD had run out, I hadn't finished my PhD, and I think I had 1 publication, and I started applying for posts, and this post came up at the Public Health Research Unit, and I went to the interview, and Alistair was in the interview, I'm pretty sure, and so was Andrew Boddy. Some of you may know Professor Andrew Boddy. He sadly died in January last year, but he was a great man, and he was a very generous and kind man. And the interview consisted of going to his office, essentially, which is Jill's office now, him smoking his pipe, and just asking me some questions. Some of them were related to the job, some weren't. Yeah, by the end of it, they more or less said I had the job. And that is where the title of this lecture comes from. It was a project, a HTA project, entitled Can we use routine data to complement and enhance RCTs? And these are the three main projects which I worked on using the routine data in Scotland, and it was a really interesting and diverse set of projects. Got to understand how to communicate and collaborate with clinicians. And as this last bullet point says, I learnt so much in terms of what we would now call data science skills, putting data sets together, merging them, manipulating them. Learnt a lot about randomized control trial, clinical trial methodology. I learnt about epidemiology, giving presentations, writing papers, etc. So I think I have a lot to be thankful for that lucky break occurred. This is one of my props. One of my props is this sits in my room. This is a picture of GDPR now. I'm not too careful if I haven't got all the consent of these people. So I've actually brought along the picture, and so I'm going to leave this here. Some people might recognise some of the people. There's a good one of me with hair, and there's a good one of Alistair Leyland with some highlights in his hair. So if you want to check that out, please feel free to. And yeah, so as I said, sadly, Andrew passed away last year, and it was a shame. His memorial was a wonderful occasion, and I know he would be very proud of me here today, and I know he was very proud of us in his unit. So this picture I managed to dig out. This is me giving my first international poster presentation at the Society of Clinical Trials in Atlanta, USA. And that, of course, as we know, is one of the wonderful perks of academia, is that you can travel a lot to conferences, to teach, and to collaborate. This was 1998. I think it's clear that poster presentation has moved on. But look at those edges. They're pretty straight. And of course, the other great thing you can do about conferences is you can often tack on holidays. And this is a picture of Lorna and I at the top of the World Trade Centers. This was pre 9/11, and I would still rate this as the best holiday we'd ever had. Pre-kids. And this is where I didn't realize at the time, but when I started thinking about this talk and started looking through materials, I noticed that Andy was in this book, another prop. So this was one of the main outputs of our work, was a chapter in this quite influential book, the Advanced Handbook, not the handbook, the Advanced Handbook of Methods in Evidence-Based Healthcare. And yes, Andy was here, and Andy was, I think, a senior research fellow at the time, and he was interested in statistical issues associated with economic evaluation, and I think it'd be fair to say he still is. And Andy comes into the story a bit later. So, what did we conclude, or rather, what did Alistair and I'm delighted that Gordon Murray here as well. Gordon was a collaborator on that first project. What did we conclude in that initial work? So essentially we were testing whether you can use routinely assembled NHS data to either substitute randomized control trials, clinical trials, or where they're not feasible, in situations where they are not feasible, or can supplement the information of trials for assessing interventions. And I think these three ways that were outlined still hold pretty well today, and this was 1998, I think this was written. So firstly, where formal RCT designs are inappropriate. Secondly, where you can use routine data to evaluate outcomes over longer periods than any trial could. And thirdly, providing a link between the constraints of a randomized control trial and the everyday practice which health services sit in. So later in this talk, I'm going to illustrate points, I think, which speak to 1 and 2, and at the end, I'm going to point to something, to say something about the third point. So what is routine data? It might be worth spending a little bit of time. It was very narrowly defined in that book about routinely assembled NHS data. And in blue below, I found a free dictionary giving a wider definition. But I think now, in the era of wearable technology, mobile phone apps, imaging, it's much broader. And I like to think of it as using data that's not originally intended for research. So kind of being efficient with the data that is already being collected. Because such data, especially here in Scotland, tends to be truly representative, often covering the whole population. This book is still available. You can get it tomorrow for 120 quid. And yeah, those more buying options I'm going to just gloss over. Okay, so onto some career highlights. So these don't really fit into the narrative of using routine data to complement and enhance RCTs, but I think they were important milestones in my career. So firstly, I was a first dabble into trying to use thought-provoking titles. So is modelling dental caries a normal thing to do? And this was about introducing generalized linear modeling to dental epidemiologists. And that's been a theme throughout my career where I like enhancing methods, I like developing methods, but I also like translating methods to areas where I think best practice is not being observed. And I've got numerous papers throughout my career that could back that assertion up. And the other two papers were pretty much my only forays into systematic reviewing. But the reason I've included them is that they've been well cited. So the second one there has been cited over 400 times, and the third one has been cited over 700 times. So I think if your H index is needing a little boost, remember systematic reviewing can be a good way forward. And then when I was in New Zealand, to be honest, from a research point of view, I was a bit isolated, so I had a lot of time for reading, and I developed this research idea myself, and this is my only, and I think it will remain my only, sole author publication, and this was where I embarked on a simulation study. I was getting interested in cluster randomized control trials, and I was comparing the performance of whether you randomize completely or randomize by stratification. And this was an absolute joy to me because statistics in medicine was a journal I always wanted to get into, and to be able to get into it on my own was a real fillip, and I'm still very proud of this paper. Unfortunately, it did have an unintended consequence of lots of people contacting me asking, could I do a sample size calculation for them for their cluster randomized control trial? And as I'm sure many of you in the audience who are statisticians will know, that's the absolute bane of your life, the late plea for a sample size calculation. So I thought it might be useful because not everyone in the room is going to be familiar with randomized trials. So I thought it might be worth just highlighting what a randomized trial is and why it's such an important study design. So this flowchart is illustrating what happens. So from the top, you enroll people into a trial. People are assessed for eligibility, and then some people are excluded because there's very stringent inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then where you see that coin toss there, that's the randomization part. Now, it's not really a coin toss. We use random number generators, but I think keep the coin toss in your mind. It's a beautifully simple design, a way of allocating people to different treatments. And what that randomization allows you to do is that once you've collected the outcomes on patients, you can be pretty confident that any differences you observe is due to the treatments the people received rather than any other factors. And so for that reason, it's a very, very strong methodological design. And when you hear on the radio about clinical trials being reported, they are typically randomized trials. But they're not perfect, so they depend on blinding. So they depend, to be free from bias, they depend for the participant in the trial not to be aware of what treatment they've received, and also for the investigator to be unaware, especially when measuring outcomes and so on. And often that blinding is not possible to achieve. Also, as you can see as you come down this figure, people get lost to follow-up in trials. It's difficult to keep on track of people. And people get excluded. So to preserve the power of the randomization, you have to do, under an intention to treat principle, you kind of have to impute data to achieve that perfect balance that the randomization gave you. But increasingly, people are asking the question, well, does the intention to treat estimate actually give me the answer to the question I'm posing? So this could be, for example, well, what if people don't adhere to treatment? What is the treatment effect then? Or if people are strong adherers, what's their safety profile? What treatments are observed then? So interestingly, randomized trial methods are now borrowing from epidemiology and causal modeling to think about other different estimators which might be of interest, especially as we move into sort of precision medicine era when we might be interested in subgroups and specific people, so we can tailor interventions to an individual, not to a group. So that, in essence, is a randomized trial. So the first paper I wanted to highlight isn't a trial. This came from research I did at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and this was based on an audit. Now, I think it's pushing it to say audit data is routine data, but it's certainly data that we used for research, which was not originally intended for that purpose. And what we analysed was different techniques for tonsillectomy. So what had happened was there was a traditional way of doing things called cold steel and ties, which is essentially, sorry, not very nice, but scalpel, tonsil's gone, and then tie. I always do a little bow, I don't know why, for the hemostasis. And when we did this research, what we found was it was actually the traditional way of doing things, the cold steel, which was producing the best results. We can see that the rates of hemorrhage, post-operative hemorrhage, often children returning to theatres with bleeding, it was, you observe better results with the traditional way of doing things rather than diathermy techniques, which is essentially using electrical current to zap the little things off. And as you can see, the relative risks are pretty large, but this is not a randomized trial, so we have to be concerned about other factors that might be causing the differences, the observed differences. So I'll come on to that in a little bit, but this was, universities now are obsessed with impact and demonstrating impact. This research had impact, and it was demonstrable. After these findings were published in the Lancet, and we went to NICE, they issued some guidance. They said that surgeons should use as little diathermy as possible. And also, one particular technique, monopolar diathermy, was to be stopped. So in this graph is an example of an interrupted time series, which is a method I didn't use much then, but we're using a lot now with many colleagues in the room. And what we have on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have the hemorrhage rate. And this vertical line here is when that guidance was published. And what we showed was that the increasing hemorrhage rate stopped after the guidance was published, and there seemed to be a leveling off and a reduction in the guidance. And also we found from the audit as well that the surgeons truly did stop using diathermy at the same level as they were prior to the guidance. So I've put in this headline that was reported at the time just to wind up my dad, really, because he reads the Times cover to cover every day. And this was an absolutely shocking headline, which totally misrepresented the research. Stop using killer tonsil instruments, doctors told. Absolutely shocking. I mean, obviously, deaths do occur, sadly, after tonsillectomy, but they're incredibly rare, and it's no way can you attribute it to a particular technique. So this is a situation where randomized trials are tricky in surgery. As you can imagine, it's difficult to blind. You generally want the surgeon to know what they're doing. The patient usually knows what's happening to them, so it's difficult to blind. And this is one of the problems in this area, was that there were a lot of trials, but a Cochrane systematic review deemed a lot of them to be of poor quality. And a largest trial which they reported, we reported on, but it wasn't part of the Cochrane review, actually found an increased risk for cold steel and diathermy versus just cold steel alone of 1.3. And that is versus the sort of the magnitude of 2.2 we were observing. So I think ever since this work, I've been interested. Well, why did the Lancet publish it? I think the Lancet published this because the relative risks were so large. They obviously prefer trials, but I think they were pretty confident that any unmeasured confounding was not going to be of the magnitude to bring these results down to the null, and so they published it. But where does the truth lie? We've got these perhaps poor randomized trials, and we've got observational evidence where we have to try and account for confounding in some other ways. So what I'm interested in is, can we use routine data to get unbiased treatment effects? So some work that I've got starting is to look at a technique called instrumental variables. So just to introduce this, in a randomized control trial, we could view the coin toss as like a perfect instrument. It decides the treatment allocation. So if it's a head, the person gets one treatment. If it's a tail, they get another. So the coin toss perfectly determines what treatment a person is going to receive. And because of the randomization, there is no confounding. So confounding here, typically a confounder is something that is associated with an outcome, but it's not associated with the exposure or the treatment being received. And the coin toss allows this, breaking that confounding relationship, and therefore is like a perfect instrument. But in observational research, can we use other things for instruments? And this is where I think there's an increasing body of research on instrumental variables, and I can only see this increasing when routine data sets are getting richer and richer. So what you need for an instrument is that the instrument has to be associated with what treatment someone's going to get, but it's not directly associated with the outcome. So that's the case with the coin toss. It determines whether they get treatment A or treatment B, but the coin toss itself and the result of that is not associated with the outcome by itself. It also can't be associated with the confounders. So in this area, those arrows in red there are common problems. You can put up an instrument, but often they fail because of these associations occurring. But I just wanted to illustrate a couple of papers that I think are quite revealing and show the potential for this work. So this paper published in JAMA, the instrument they used was the difference in the distance between a hospital with a high intensive care unit admission and the distance to the nearest hospital of any type. And what they were interested in was the association between the intensive care that received and mortality amongst patients who had pneumonia. So cutting to the chase, if you did a normal regression approach, the absolute difference was very large in a particular direction. And then when you did a standard way of adjusting for confounding, again using regression, it certainly attenuated the effect, but it was still in the same direction. When they introduced the instrumental variable, the effect size changed direction. It changed direction. So, and importantly, it passed the tests that you need for it to be a good instrument. So here is an example that doing a very well-conducted logistic regression, doing a very well-conducted propensity score approach, doesn't deal with unmeasured confounding in observational data sets. And in these situations, I wonder whether we are missing a trick. We should be more keen in searching for instruments. So this instrument is based on distance. Here's one based on preference, and this is leading to some work that I'm going to be doing where the instrument is a physician's preference for prescribing a particular drug or intervention. And the first author here, Neil Davies, he came up to the Institute of Health and Wellbeing and gave a talk on instrumental variables and other things a few years ago, and that's where my interest in this area started. And he published this paper looking at varenicline, which is a drug prescribed to try and quit smoking. And they compared it to nicotine replacement therapy. And again, the same thing happened. basically the authors showed that it was very unlikely that there was no unmeasured confounding. These red lines show the effect over time. They're using the routine data because it could go further on in time, the assessment. And if you were to believe the propensity score or the regression, you would believe that varenicline was effective in improving risk. But if you look at the instrument in blue, no such effect was found. So it's worth pointing out a subtlety here, though, is that whereas a logistic regression or a propensity score gives you like an average treatment effect, using an instrumental variable approach does not achieve that. It's appropriate for the so-called marginal patient. It's applicable to those people where the instrument actually determines what treatment is received. So if we go back to the earlier case, there might be some cases where the patient is in such a bad condition that they were going to go to the ICU, whatever. It didn't matter the distance to the hospital. So these results won't generalize to those groups. It's those patients in the margins where there's kind of, I don't know, equipoise, if you like, about and they can let the instrument determine which treatment is received. And so I don't think we fully understand how we can identify these marginal patients in routine data. And then we've got the same issue as with trials about, well, who exactly do these instrumental variable results generalize to? So when I explain my kind of career path at that circle, after spending time with Pardeep and doing epidemiology in public health, this is where Andy comes back into the story, and I got a free transfer from public health to health economics and health technology assessment team after being convinced by Andy that would be a good idea. And it was all above board. There was no bungs involved. It was just a transfer across. And part of what appealed to me was, as much as I enjoyed the epidemiology work, moving into health economics and health technology assessment got me back into looking at interventions and looking at things where actually you can try and improve patient outcomes, whereas epidemiology is of course important as well, but it's maybe one or two more steps removed from that. And this is another aspect. This first project I worked on with Andy is another aspect of where we can use routine data to enhance and complement randomized trials. So decision makers such as NICE, they use randomized evidence, but you might have heard of a quality adjusted life year or a life year. Often they're using these metrics to make decisions. Randomized trials are not observed across the whole lifetime, so we need modeling approaches to estimate what remaining life expectancy is achieved with this treatment versus not receiving this treatment. So Andy was PI on a grant to develop a Scottish cardiovascular disease policy model using Scottish routine data. And we linked up a Scottish Heart Health survey to hospitalizations and deaths. And people start in this event, this position here, event-free, they haven't got any cardiovascular disease. And the work that I got involved in with Pardeep was looking at competing risks to estimate the cumulative incidence of moving into one of these health states. And some of the methodological development here was we moved this from a semi-parametric approach to a parametric approach to allow the extrapolation into overall life expectancy. And this little animation illustrates how patients flow from a starting CVD-free state into a final state. So this is a bit morbid. You get kind of used to this stuff when you do it all the time. But everyone has to end up dead, all right? And so here they are. They can end up in a post-IHD state, death state, post-stroke death, or they can die as a competing risk of cardiovascular disease, or they can die of other causes. And so what this project allowed us to do was it allowed us to extrapolate using the routine data, and we used WASCOPS, another important study from Glasgow which showed the importance of using routine data to assess long-term follow-up of a cardiovascular trial. We externally validated the first events against that, and Heather, who's here, who's also part of our first public health research unit, helped with that. And so there's no getting away, I don't think, for that the use of routine data in health economics. If you want to go beyond trial evidence to inform a health economic model, you need epidemiology, you need long-term follow-up, and you need to assess potential competing risks that are happening which maybe aren't captured in a trial. And this research also had some impact. Andy and I went along a few times to a clinical guidelines development in Scotland, and we were acknowledged in their guidelines for the assistance we provided. Moving on to sort of the final set of research I wanted to highlight, and this is becoming increasingly part of what I do. And this is where I would like to argue that I don't think randomized trials are needed at all. It's not about complementing and supplementing them. I think you don't need them. And the reason you don't need them is often they're impossible to do. So it's not a case of not needing them, it's more they're just impossible to do, or there's not the political will to do them. But also because I think the techniques using observational data and the study designs allow very strong internal validity. Maybe not as strong as a trial, but very strong internal validity, and triangulating with other data and evidence from elsewhere gives a strong evidence base about whether an intervention works or not. So the interventions that I'm going to illustrate are firstly an alcohol act, and secondly a change in drink drive legislation that happened here in Scotland. So firstly, the Alcohol Act was implemented on 1st of October 2011, and what this stopped was essentially it was multiple discounting. So this picture here, you can see special offer 2 for £15, save £5. So much to my brother-in-law Arthur's disgust, these kind of offers stopped overnight. He was raging. And obviously the intention is to restrict incentives, encouraging consumers to purchase more than they intended to, and thereby reduce consumption. So here's another sort of interrupted time series design of alcohol sales data. So you can see in the black line, the solid black line is Scottish litres of pure alcohol per adult, and the dashed line is what the wimpy English and Welsh folk can manage. And you can see that it's a massive discrepancy, but joking aside, it's absolutely shocking and stark differences. You can also see the massive seasonal peaks at Christmas, and some seasonal peaks in summer months, especially if it coincides with like a World Cup or Olympics. This here is when the Alcohol Act was introduced, and I'm sure many of you can kind of try and look at that. Looking at that, it's hard to see there's been an effect in terms of the Scottish alcohol consumption compared to England and Wales. When we went under the bonnet of it a bit more and we did our statistical analyses, that was indeed the case. So for all alcohol, there was a kind of a suggestive reduction of around 2.5% of alcohol consumption, but we were quite uncertain about the size of the effect. However, what we did observe was a larger effect in the subcategory of wine. And this was plausible because a lot of the promotions in the supermarkets were wine-based. It's like buy 3 bottles of wine for £10. And the other area where there was an effect, albeit it's a very small part of the market, was the ready-to-drink drinks. So, not great evidence that the Alcohol Act reduced alcohol consumption, but maybe some better evidence that it did reduce wine sales. So Jill mentioned I direct the MSc in Health Technology Assessment, and this work was carried out by one of the students at the time, Janet Boutel, who is now a member of the HETA staff. And what she did was she looked at a different approach called synthetic controls to analyse the sales data. And essentially, what you do in a synthetic control approach is rather than compare to England and Wales as a whole, you essentially try and get a weighted average based on different regions within England and Wales, which represents Scotland. So when we were talking about all drinks, it turned out that our synthetic control comprised about 68% from the northeast of England, about 17% from the northwest, and about 15% from the south and southeast. And that kind of made sense to us because a lot of people were arguing, don't compare to the whole of England and Wales, compare to northeast and northwest, they're more alike to Scotland. But the problem we had was, because Scotland was is kind of the outlier here, Scotland had the drinking problem, we could not get a good match, even with a weighted approach. Ideally, you want this dashed line to overlay the solid line in the pre-period, and then you can see what happens to the synthetic Scotland versus the real Scotland. Furthermore, when Janet looked at wine, it was less convincing actually that there actually was a wine effect with that methodology. And yes, and again the synthetic control, you can see that when you've moved to wine, Scotland becomes a bit more like the south and southeast. So these are more plots which look at outcomes for Alcohol Act, to evaluate the Alcohol Act, not sales, but actually hospitalizations for alcohol-related causes and deaths for alcohol-related causes. And again, we didn't really see any evidence that the Alcohol Act reduced hospital admissions and deaths in the short term. But nevertheless, although these were null findings, they were an important precursor for minimum unit pricing, which has now come in Scotland, and which, along with Mark and Neve in the audience here and others, we are evaluating. So very quickly, in the interest of time, another study I was involved in, I led on, was evaluating the change in drink drive legislation which happened in December 2014. There was good evidence that this should reduce road traffic accidents in Scotland, and it was part of the overall Scottish Government strategy to change Scotland's relationship with alcohol. There was really good evidence from Australia, very high quality interrupted time series work, which showed that we could expect to observe reductions in road traffic accidents. And my colleague Hura Hagbanahan, I don't know, yeah, Hura's there. So Hura was a researcher who led on this project. But unfortunately, we did not observe a reduction in road traffic accidents. So these left panels are Scotland, and on the right here is England and Wales. This top panel is overall road traffic accident rates. The bottom panel is serious or fatal road traffic accident rates. And we did not observe what we expected to observe. And again, when we looked at some of the other quantitative data and alongside some of the qualitative evaluation that Neve led, what we found was accompanying enforcement just was not there, or it was not there to a necessary level. So this table illustrates the amount spent on campaigns, drink drive campaigns. And you can see, because of austerity and other things, the huge reduction in the amount spent on drink drive campaigns, and this coincided in the period after the change in drink drive law had changed. Okay, so that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of my career highlights. In terms of future plans, I'm really excited by the instrumental variable approach. I've got a grant at the moment with Alcohol Change UK, where we're going to explore how good the prescribing information system data is in Scotland for using a physician prescribing preference as an instrument. So we're specifically looking at interventions, drugs used to treat harmful drinkers, but we're also going to look at the feasibility of using physician prescribing preference as an instrument. I'm also starting to have conversations around our institute about other people who are using the prescribing data and for any other comparative effectiveness work we could do where we could try and find instruments. So I think this is an area where routine data, especially if it's rich in covariates, and we can find these instruments, they can be elusive, but if we can find them, I think it's a very powerful way in this area of precision medicine and precision public health. If these instruments work, it opens things up because it's not on a very strict eligibility criteria trial. It's often on the whole population. It allows you to look at subgroups. Many trials aren't powered for subgroups, and it allows you to look at long-term outcomes. In terms of decision analytic models, currently working on a diabetes policy model with many in this room, especially looking at a front end using R-Shiny to be able to use these decision models in real-time kind of decision making, maybe in a NICE meeting and so on. There's been a recent paper on the future of cost-effective analysis in health and medicine, and they talked about the importance of comparative modeling, where we can use different types of approach to model and the structure of the models to explore differences. At the moment, perhaps too much is taken for granted when a particular economic model is produced, whereas this, if you look at the structural uncertainty, it will allow us to unpick any problems. That paper also talked about the problems of high computing of discrete event simulations, individual simulations, taking a long time to run in a real live decision-making context. Then it talks about the use of emulators. But I wonder and expect whether these kind of cohort modelling approaches, where you take a cohort of people using our rich Scottish data, which has increasingly got a long time span, and doing the modelling that way would be a much more time-efficient approach. And so our project is looking at comparing the run speeds and the results we get. And finally, the interrupted time series work. I've I'm PI on a grant application looking at some statistical aspects of this interrupted time series design to get under the bonnet more about whether this method whether statistical methods are robust and certain problems with them, and to try and produce some guidelines to researchers, as well as a lot of applied work, for example, evaluating the minimum unit price for alcohol. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip these ones, and I'm going to come along to my final slide to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you to all my collaborators, colleagues, and family and friends. Thank you very much to Mum and Dad for, well, being my mum and dad and always being there for me. Thanks to Charlotte and Alistair. Hope you might understand a bit more what Dad does at work now. And lastly, thank you very much to Lorna, my wife. As many of you know, when you've got two partners juggling career, kids, family life, it's not always plain sailing. So against that backdrop, all the love and support you give me is all the more remarkable. So thank you very much. So thank you.